Well, everyone, it's time for another skeptical review of a game that I've been very interested in, as have many of you guys. Wolong Fallen Dynasty. This is the latest game from Team Ninja, the team that brought us Nioh 1 and 2 most famously. Those games were polished, refined, and extremely difficult, while also balancing that out with a satisfaction from its combat and boss fights that was frankly unparalleled. Before anybody says it, of course these games fit into the Soulsborne genre, the genre of games pretty much pioneered by From Software, the same guys that brought us Elden Ring last year. And so while Team Ninja is certainly a very competent team of developers, it's next to impossible to discuss Wolong without bringing up the games that many consider to be the standard bearers for this entire genre. Don't worry, I'll avoid the Elden Ring and Sekiro and Dark Souls comparisons ad nauseum for obvious reasons. I just don't think it's helpful. It's kind of the elephant in the room. What I will say up front is that there's a reason that those games are considered the standard bearers. They have phenomenally well-designed worlds and levels, the artistic design is tremendous, the boss fights are always tough but fair, the animations are extremely tight, the hitboxes are ridiculously accurate, and so on and so forth. And that's the standard that these games have to live up to, both From Software and all of these other studios making games in the same genre. And this is important because these games aren't actually fun if they fail to live up to that standard. Tough combat is only satisfying when it feels fair. If you lose a boss fight because of a stray hit or swing from an enemy that really shouldn't have connected or dealt damage, you will likely grow frustrated and possibly even quit entirely, especially if you've spent hours upon hours trying to get past that given encounter. The importance of polish and refinement in games like this cannot be overstated. It's everything. To put it simply, a clunky or unrefined Soulsborne game is simply a bad one. And so going into Wolong Fallen Dynasty, I was simply hoping to see a fleshed out combat system with action RPG mechanics to match, something which this team certainly has done before very well in the Nioh games. I wanted to see decent level design, artistic design that keeps things interesting visually, and perhaps most importantly, a collection of boss fights and encounters that are unique, fair, fun, and difficult. Heck, they can even be extremely difficult. But it's crucial that the animation timings, the hitboxes, the signalings, and everything else are polished. And considering this is coming from Team Ninja, I had very high hopes. I really liked Nioh 1 and 2, and I still think that they have a heck of a lot more nuance as far as the action RPG mechanics are concerned than a lot of other games in this category. While I'm naturally skeptical of games like this, especially because they are very difficult to pull off, a team like Team Ninja is certainly capable. So what did I find out? Does it live up to those standards, or is it yet another game that tries and falls just short of living up to that ideal? Well, let's talk about it. But first, a big thank you to our sponsor, Raycon. Raycon is offering premium audio at prices that don't break the bank. Whether you're looking for everyday earbuds, low latency gaming headphones, or just a speaker with a battery that will last you all night at a party, Raycon has got you covered. Personally, I'm one of those people that likes to have earbuds with me pretty much everywhere I go. I'm one of those guys. And so I always like stuff that's smaller, that's more portable, and low profile. And these right here are the everyday earbuds, and I've got to say, I've actually been very impressed. Not only do they come in my favorite color of red that I've probably seen on any electronics ever. I mean, can you tell I like red stuff? It's like kind of a giveaway. But the earbuds are also actually extremely comfortable, which is saying something because my ears are, for lack of a better term, weird. They pair super easily with any phone, whether you're using an iPhone or an Android device. They just work. And with this pair, they actually offer different sound profiles, which if I hold down this button for just 3 seconds, it'll toggle between the 3 sound profiles. One which is meant to be super accurate for music, podcasts if you want the voices to be really accurate, a standard balance mode as well. And then they also have a bass focused mode if you like to have a heavy bass line. And it's as easy as just holding down the button for 3 seconds. It's great. Or if you're at the gym and you're working out, doing your thing, apparently this is the gym for me now. All you have to do to switch between noise isolation mode and awareness mode is hold down this one for 3 seconds and then it passes the audio through so you can actually hear stuff around you. If somebody's talking to you, you can interact with them. It's like super effortless. And then again, you just hold it down and you swap back and get back into your groove. And listen, I know it can be stressful buying electronics online, just because a YouTuber is saying that they like them, but Raycon understands that, and that's why every purchase is extremely easy. They offer buy now or pay later options and easy, effortless returns if you happen to have any problems at all. But I'm sure you're not gonna have any problems at all, because Raycon's everyday earbuds, these I'm using right now, have over 50,000 5-star reviews. And more than anything, you're just getting a great pair of headphones, whether you are going to the gym, working in a coffee shop, or just going about your day-to-day and you just want to be able to listen to a YouTube video or to a podcast or your music. You can do that all effortlessly with a high quality premium pair of headphones at a price that's fair and not ridiculous. Like, these things are actually shockingly affordable. And I'm actually very impressed with how long these things can run on just a single charge. It's actually quite impressive. Like, according to the stat sheet that I got, this little carrying case can offer 32 hours of playback charge to the earbuds that are inside. That's ridiculous. If you're ready to buy something small with a big impact, click the link in the description box below or go to buyraycon.com/Luke Stevens to get 15% off of your Raycon purchase. Again, check them out at the link in the video description box below or in the pinned comment. Awesome. Okay, back into it. Again, thank you, Raycon. The first thing I need to touch on real quick is why you're going to be seeing multiple characters in the gameplay I'm about to show you. This is sort of a PSA, a public service announcement for all of you guys. I played this game on PlayStation 5 because that's the only codes that they had available. And I ran into twice a glitch in the PlayStation cloud save system, which deleted all of my progress and save file, basically like corrupted it in the cloud. I've never had this happen before, but basically I lost 2 different characters and in total around 7 hours of gameplay as a result of this glitch. Basically, you would finish on one console, it would try to upload to the cloud, it would glitch out, get caught in a cycle where it couldn't figure out which was the actual save to keep, and the only way I could fix it was by deleting that save in the cloud storage panel in the PS5 settings and then just making a new save. And the only thing that fixed it was turning off automatic save syncs with the cloud. So if you have those turned on by default, maybe check that out. Maybe I'm just one in a billion that ran into this, but it was extremely frustrating and I don't want any of you to have that problem either. So maybe check those settings until PlayStation makes like a patch, because nothing sucks harder than spending an hour or 2 getting past a boss that's very, very difficult, getting past it and winning, and then having to start over because you lost your save file for no reason. I don't think it was this game's fault, but it seems to be a PlayStation issue, so certainly keep your eyes out for that. With all that said, let's get into the actual nitty-gritty of the game. The glasses are going on. Nerd Luke is here. To begin, I'm going to go through the opening section of the game briefly. This only constitutes the first 20 minutes or so I wouldn't count this as much of a spoiler, but if you do, I can respect that. I have timestamped when this portion of the video is over, so you can skip ahead if you want, though I will say that games like these are not the types to be spoiled in the same way as, let's say, narrative games. Wolong Fallen Dynasty is about the gameplay, not necessarily the narrative, and I won't be discussing any of the story in this section of the review. The game starts out relatively slow, with tight corridors leading you through some quick tutorial sections. They break down the basics, how to equip your melee weapons, your armor sets, and various usable items, such as the Dragon's Cure Pot, which is what's used to restore HP and what can be refilled at flag posts, which are this game's versions of campfires or lanterns in the Soulsborne games. This is all extremely standard and nothing to write home about, and it's something we've even seen before in the Nioh games. I was quickly taken aback, though, as I pushed through this opening section of the game, where I realized that they were reusing the same building at least 7 times that I counted in the first 10 minutes of the game. This starts to get a little concerning because it's something the player simply shouldn't notice as far as I'm concerned. Designing these levels with reused assets is extremely common. Everybody does it. But if the player notices that things are being copy and pasted, it means it was done in a very obvious and haphazard way, and level designers are often trained to disguise this repeated use in various ways, with different furniture inside mirroring the structure or breaking the rooms up with enemies and the like. The fact that in the first 10 minutes we're already seeing pretty lackluster level design got me a little bit worried. And honestly, it's a concern that would prove all the more accurate as the game went on, but more on that in a moment. In addition to this, the walkways and areas that you'll be exploring during this opening section are extremely tight. Furthermore, the texture quality is extremely poor, and the level more broadly just feels like tight corridors leading you from one enemy encounter to the next. But this is a tutorial section, so we can kind of forgive that. After a few short minutes, and after defeating some grunt enemies and getting a feel for the attack timings, the dodge, etc., you're going to be faced with your first mini-boss, or you can choose to push on to the main boss of this area and leave the mini-boss behind. I decided to take on the mini-boss, which was this weird tiger-looking thing. As you can see, he has a higher number above his head than I have above my health bar. That's the number that represents the morale rank. This is a system that Wo Long uses to encourage you to continue playing aggressively and to go from encounter to encounter, growing stronger with each level. The game doesn't tell you exactly how this affects gameplay other than this description in the tutorial section of the Documents tab, where it describes the morale rank as something which, quote, affects your strength in battle, end quote, and it says, quote, the same goes for your enemies, end quote, whatever that means. They go on to describe that an enemy's morale rank, should it be higher than yours, will mean that they will present a much greater threat to you. This level can be reduced in combat by completing a special heavy attack once you've broken a character's guard, which should mean that they grow weaker. In the case of long boss fights, which we'll discuss in a moment, this can be an interesting way of altering these encounters. Technically speaking, if you're doing a good job of deflecting attacks, which is this game's version of parrying, the boss should, in theory, get easier as the fight goes on, at least in terms of their damage output, though this isn't always the case because sometimes bosses have their own way of boosting their morale, especially later in the game. In addition, often their attacks get even more frenetic and chaotic, something that causes a few issues in this opening section for new players. It creates a clear guide of where you're supposed to go in levels, especially later on in the game where boss encounters might occur at morale level 20 or 25, and you have to grind your way all the way up there by leveling up your fortified rank, which basically means you set the floor for where your morale is going to be if you die. It doesn't reset to 0. This pairs with the flagpole system, which encourages you to explore levels. We'll talk about that more later. But all told, I didn't really feel like this added as much dynamism to the game as the devs were thinking it would. More generally, it just feels like another sub-level to the character because you have your character's level that dictates your overall strength and stats and that type of thing. And then you have the morale level, which is like a sub-level within your level. So you can be fighting enemies that are the same level as you are, but if you're at different morale rankings, it's not fair anymore. It's like a different level within the level, if that makes any sense at all. And honestly, for me, it more often than not just felt like a way of guiding the player through levels instead of encouraging open exploration, which you might really enjoy if you're a new player to these types of games, but often it made it feel like these levels were much more linear than they actually are. Because you'll run from one area of the map into another, see that there's high-level enemies over there in terms of morale rank, and you'll just go a different route where enemies are lower, which eventually loops up around to that higher-level area. So you don't actually end up exploring levels, you end up following along a very narrow and specific track. Again, it's an interesting idea, but I didn't feel as though it really added much to the game. It's just sort of an indirect way of controlling the player's movements through the levels and of forcing them to explore every nook and cranny of the chapters that you'll be going through. Again, there's a lot more to say on that. But back to our weird tiger mini-boss friend here. This is the first example of a boss that has a more complicated moveset. Prior to this, you've only been fighting humanoid grunts who offer little challenge. However, it was in this first fight that I realized something very strange was going on with the parry system. You see, this game's version of parrying is called deflection. You do it by tapping the circle button, or B if you're on Xbox, at the precise moment the attack is coming into you. It's pretty standard as far as action RPGs are concerned, and I personally love parry-based combat systems because they encourage aggressive gameplay. And of course, this is the reason that everybody constantly brings up this game's similarity to Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, especially because enemies will often have unblockable attacks which prompts them with a big red circle, just like in Sekiro. which you have to parry, and really you're going to need to get those parry timings down, because after the first 5 or 8 hours or so, pretty much every boss is straight up undefeatable unless you are parrying pretty much everything they do, since there's no other way to break their spirit gauge, opening them to heavy damage attacks, which actually make a difference in the health bar. All told, parrying is very, very important in this game. Now, because this game is so focused on balancing your spirit gauge, which is the gauge underneath your health bar that's also used like mana to redeem heavier attacks, improve your basic attacks, or do spirit attacks, which offer all sorts of cool boosts, you will constantly find yourself pushing in towards the enemy as opposed to running away, because this is the only way that you fill up that gauge. And I think that this is, in general, really great. I love this because it forces players to get in there and get their hands dirty. And when it comes together, it feels really, really good. If you played Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, there are many opportunities in this game where you will start to feel as though it's clicking and things just work. You'll take on enemies and you're parrying the crap out of them, and it's just fluid and you feel like a badass. It's just awesome. But it doesn't start awesome. In fact, it starts pretty sucky in the tutorial section, especially if you aren't used to these types of games where you kind of keep a level head, not frantically button mash or lose your cool. For newer players to these types of games, there's one serious issue with how they routed the buttons. You see, they made the dodge and the parry button the same button. The difference is, if you want to parry, you tap circle once or B once, and if you want to roll or dodge, you double tap it quickly. What's the problem with that? Well, simply that in a hectic, chaotic battle, especially for new players, when they're trying to figure out the timings for dodging and parrying these flurried, frenzied attacks, which, bear in mind, for boss fights, they generally get more chaotic as the boss fight goes on, players will often accidentally dodge when they're just trying to parry the attacks. It's unbelievable that they made this button the same button for both actions. And before anybody brings it up, yes, I did go into the menus and try to reroute this, but you're not actually able to. The game thankfully allows you to manually alter button routings, but you'll find once you go into this menu that you can only move the dodge and deflect command to a different button. You can't actually separate the two actions. This is at least the case on PlayStation 5 on launch day. Maybe on the PC version you can tweak this a little bit more precisely, or maybe they'll patch this later to allow you to route the dodge button to a separate button entirely and have a dedicated button for deflections. I think the reason they did this is because in the game, if you are basically over encumbered and you're carrying too much stuff, or you have too heavy of armor for your current, what's effectively your endurance stat, then instead of actually parrying, you automatically roll. So one time I wasn't really paying attention. I put on armor that was too heavy, and I was confused when I was getting attacked, and I just kept rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling into enemies, and I wasn't actually doing any parrying or deflection of them. And I realized, oh, it's because when you are over encumbered, you can't parry, not even slowly, you just roll instead. And if that's really the reason that they made these buttons the same button, I'm utterly baffled. And I can't even tell you how many times in this first hectic, crazy tutorial mini boss tiger fight that I accidentally rolled instead of parrying when I should have parried. It's extremely frustrating. And unfortunately, I think a lot of players who are new to these types of games are going to grow so frustrated that something just isn't working that they'll probably put the game down and move on, which is really unfortunate, because once you do get the hang of this parry system, it feels really, really good. There are a handful of bosses, especially ones later in the game, that are particularly chaotic, which I would argue have attack patterns occasionally that are a little close for comfort. Basically, when attacks are too tight together, in order to parry them, you have to tap circle very, very quickly in quick succession. But if it's too quickly, you won't actually parry, and instead you'll roll, which means it doesn't matter how accurate your timings are, you'll just start rolling instead of parrying, which is really, really annoying. I mean, look at this guy's attacks. Like this attack right here with the horns. What the hell am I supposed to do? Like, I get it. Don't be there. Get good, bro. Move. I get it. But The whole game is about parrying. How badass would it be if this was a dedicated button and you could just parry, which occasionally I was able to do for some reason, but other times I would just randomly start rolling around. It's not consistent, and frankly, it doesn't feel fair. And the fact that there isn't a clear answer as to why this happens, it just seems like sometimes you roll in moments like these when you're trying to parry these attacks and other times you don't, means that it's just a little loose and sloppy, at least as far as I'm concerned. I think that this should have been routed to its separate dedicated parry button or deflect button, and then leave the roll as its own routing separately. I just don't know why they did this. But like I said, once you overcome this frustration, the combat's extremely satisfying and smooth. And once it clicked for me, I was able to beat the tiger pretty easily. But as I rushed in to loot his corpse, I was frustrated once again when I found that the only piece of equipment that was on his body as loot for overcoming this foe was in fact significantly worse than what I was already using. I'm sure I don't need to explain to you how frustrating it is to spend 15 minutes grinding out a mini-boss only to find out it was effectively a waste of time. Unless you're one of those types that's like, it's not actually about the boss fight, Luke, it's about the friends you made along the way, in which case I can't even argue with you. Fair point. But after this, I pushed on to the main boss of this intro area, with admittedly conflicted expectations. Maybe this intro section was just thrown together quickly to get players on the ground running so they could encounter this boss fight and the game could really kick off. Or maybe, just maybe, this introductory area of the game was just a condensed version of what the rest of the game would have to offer. I jumped down the ledge to see which it would be. And what ensued was actually kind of awesome. The boss fight was epic, it was difficult, and yet it felt fair, and all told, it felt really good. It's extremely clear that this boss fight is meant to gate check players and make sure that they understand how the deflection and parry system works before letting them into later areas of the game, but they managed to set this up in a way where it doesn't feel like they're just slapping the player upside the head every time they fail. It feels as though you know what went wrong and what you could be doing better. And like I said, once this clicks with you in this introductory section, you're gonna get the hang of it, and you'll start to look forward to and try to bait these huge unblockable attacks where you have to parry it in order to avoid it. You start to welcome them because those increase the spirit meter even further so that you can break them and deal heavy damage to get through the boss fight. And that, in my mind, is a sign of a really successful combat system. When you are excited to be attacked with a very, very powerful heavy attack that you can't block and you have to deal with. That means that you are comfortable, you are confident, and you are competent in that system. I love this. I'm sure a lot of new players to these types of games who try this fight out will get frustrated and might even spend a few hours on this. But trust me, if you can push through it, you will be very, very happy with yourself. You will have not only gotten your feet under you and risen to the challenge, but you also will have overcome the encounter and feel like $1,000,000 as a result. And I did. So after this introductory section, getting through this boss fight and the mini boss fight, I had conflicting feelings, but what started out kind of negative actually turned into a real positive once I saw what this game does really, really well. And that is the combat mixed with the boss fights. I thought to myself, maybe this is just one of those games that has a solid combat system and great boss encounters that are encased in a pretty lackluster package. I wasn't sure if this was certainly going to be the case, but now I was ready to go through the rest of the game cautiously optimistic. At this point, I was pretty confident that this wasn't going to be a 10 out of 10, groundbreaking, genre-defining game, but it probably had something interesting to offer in those boss fights and in its pretty comprehensive action RPG systems. And the rest of my time with the game would go on to prove this point. Over the course of the rest of the game, you'll go through various areas, fighting countless grunt enemies on your way to boss encounters, which are all unique, both visually and in terms of mechanics, and once you unlock the ability to use co-op and some of the higher level magic abilities and weapons, it can actually get pretty crazy. There really is a lot here, and a lot of it is surprisingly good. As I mentioned, the parry system is extremely extremely important. Once you get past this first boss fight, and certainly through the first couple of chapters of the game, you will be very confident with this parrying. This means that the only real challenge comes from either boss fights where one mistake can lead to you being one-shotted and dying instantly, or with new enemies that you haven't gotten a ton of experience with that have new and different attack patterns and styles, which you have to learn, and then they become much more manageable, or with group encounters where you're fighting multiple enemies all at the same time, something that's much easier to deal with once you get access to some of the game's spells, which are great for controlling masses with all sorts of different things such as poison or fire effects. There were many times when I would come up on a group of enemies huddling around, and instead of trying to take them on one by one as I would in classical games of this genre, I instead went for an AoE spell attack to deal massive damage to the group and then push in to clean up with a larger weapon that has broad sweeping attacks. And this is something the game does really well. It encourages you to have multiple weapons equipped, such as the crossbow, the sword, and then maybe a heavy weapon, like a gigantic mace that looks like a pine cone on the end of a toothpick, and to take on encounters using these different weapons, even within different phases of the same fight. For some bosses, the first phase is manageable and slow moving, and then the second phase is utterly chaotic, meaning you can only get in there quickly to deal swipe damage and then get out. Some may call me a heathen for not being a purist and using one weapon through the entire encounter, but I was actually surprised to see just how good it felt to build a character loadout, all of the stats with two weapons in mind, and balance them together in an encounter, swapping between them when you needed to. It shows how strong this RPG system is within this game, and as far as I could tell, there wasn't really a way to break it. They really know their stuff, and you can tell that these are the guys that made Nioh. One of the frustrations I do have, though, are these companions. Pretty much every chapter of the game that you'll go through, you'll be paired with at least one AI companion. You can go through these sections co-op with friends if you want to, but I don't have any friends who are YouTubers and reviewers, and they didn't send me any extra codes, so I didn't have the opportunity to do that. You can matchmake randomly with people online, but because this version of the game I was playing was pre-launch, I could never get the servers working, and after sitting on the menu for like 10 minutes, nobody came to help me when I tried to summon someone. So I really don't know if this works well. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I haven't heard any problems, but I wasn't really able to get it working. What I will say is that the AI is pretty freaking dumb. I can't even tell you how many times there was a massive attack coming in from a boss and these guys would just stand there and take it, not even attempting to roll out of the way. I'm not asking that every single one of these AI NPCs is secretly IBM's Watson. All I'm asking is that they perform basic functions that you would expect an AI companion to do, such as moderate self-preservation and dealing out even the slightest hint of damage to make them useful in fights. You can boost the companions by holding down R1 or right bumper on Xbox and pressing up on the D-pad or down on the D-pad if you have two companions and you apply it to both of them. And that helps them become competent. I don't know what switch gets flipped when you do that, but they seem to be much more useful once you do that. But honestly, the only thing they're really useful for, as far as I can tell, is for distracting the boss and pulling aggro, which can be certainly useful, but there's no way to directly command them to take aggro or to then let off and heal and then go take aggro again. They just kind of do their own thing, and you have to hope that they take the boss's attention and frustrate it enough that it starts attacking them instead of you, so you can actually deal damage. But all told, it's really weak. I'm sure playing with friends is far better than this, because this is scraping the bottom of the barrel. It's pretty rough. One of the other things that's rough with regards to the combat system is the severe lack of enemy variety. Like I mentioned, the only times that you really will feel challenged with the parries are either boss fights, new enemies that offer differently paced attacks, or group encounters. Group encounters are reasonably managed. Boss fights are, of course, going to be unique each time you find them, but enemy variety is something that the game either has or it doesn't. And I hate to say that this game really lacks in that department. After the first few chapters, I felt as though I had seen every archetype of enemy that I was probably going to see. And even after that, over the course of the next 5 to 10 hours, I only saw one new enemy type, which was really just a twist on an enemy type we had already seen. They will also start to recycle bosses that you've already fought into some new enemy fodder that you will find while exploring levels. I could say that this is awesome because it gives you the chance to see how far you've progressed, that now you can handle these guys like it's no problem, even though they do have lower health and damage output. But all told, I just found this to be sort of lazy, and I didn't like seeing these bosses recycled. Instead, it just left a bad taste in my mouth. It felt like they were trying to find a way to shake up these levels and make them more difficult, so they just started copying and pasting stuff, which again is a perception I had in the first few minutes of the game, that a lot of stuff would be repeated here. And speaking of those first impressions I had with the game, let's talk about the level design and how this game looks. Many of these levels that you'll be exploring have shockingly poor texture quality and honestly just look flat out bad. Probably the best example I could point to is this second level that you'll be going through, where honestly it looks as though you're running around a gigantic burnt chicken nugget. Maybe I'm alone here, but I really don't think this game is graphically on par with where it needs to be to compete with other peers in this category. I understand that this is a cross-generational game, but that's not really excusing a lot of this, especially because there are other games that have come out recently which are cross-generational and look significantly better than this one while also offering much larger levels. Granted, most players who are going to get a lot out of a game like this are not playing it for the graphics. They're playing it for the gameplay, the combat, the boss fights, etc. So graphical fidelity really is not that important to them. Even to a certain extent, level design and the quality of the assets is not that important. However, that being said, I just have to make it clear that there are many times in this game where I felt as though I was playing like an Xbox 360 game. And honestly, if you told me that this was just like a new anniversary edition of a game that launched in 2012, I would probably believe you. There's nothing it does that feels as though it came out in this decade at all. It's all quite outdated in terms of approach to level design. Again, the graphical fidelity is pretty piss poor most of the time. The only time when it starts to look a little better is in cutscenes, but even then, there's weird artifacting, there's weird things going on. So all told, it's not great. It's certainly not a looker. It's kind of a piggy. That being said, I will say that the armor designs and the boss designs in general are pretty cool, but it seems as though the art direction budget went entirely into those two categories and nowhere else. Maybe these levels are actually really, really beautiful and it's just the way that they're laid out that prevents you from seeing all of the beautiful detail, but honestly, I would consider that a problem in and of itself. And frankly, this is why I find video games so cool, because when they work well, it's a beautiful combination of a bunch of different art forms. It's a variable stew of different flavors of artistry, a little art design over here, combat design over there, with the music tying it all together, all wrapped in the broth of graphical fidelity to make it go down more easily. But frankly, just like a good soup, one phenomenal ingredient does not make the dish as a whole worth the price tag. In other words, just because this game's combat is amazing doesn't mean that you can excuse all of the issues that are scattered throughout. And listen, I know that you might personally not care about graphical fidelity or texture quality in a game like this. That's awesome. Frankly, I don't really care about it that much, but I'm going to tell you if the level I'm exploring looks like a topographical map of somebody's psoriasis on their lower leg. After all, these reviews are more about giving you information about the game, and then you can decide if that's a big deal to you or not. As I'm describing this parry, deflect, dodge, roll issue with the button mappings, you might be looking at that and be like, huh, get good, bro. That's no biggie deal for me. I'm good with that, diggity dog. Don't stress about that, in which case it's not a big deal for you. But there are going to be people out there who hear these things and it does affect their consideration of the game. It makes them think more positively or more negatively of it. So I just want to stress that just because something might not be a big issue for you, it is going to be a big issue for other people, certainly. But back to it. One of the things that they did that was really interesting, which I mentioned briefly before, was that they try to force the player to explore every nook and cranny of the levels that they've laid out here by tying the morale rank rank to these flagpoles that you have to claim as you work your way through the levels to the major boss of that chapter. It's an interesting idea, certainly, and it's one that's been tried before, basically making it so you prepare your character for the boss encounter by going through this chapter's map very carefully. And if you choose not to explore every nook and cranny, you will be at a considerable disadvantage compared to where the boss is at. And frankly, I like this, at least as a concept, but in practice here in Wo Long Fallen Dynasty, it often feels as though you are being forced to explore very clumsily designed levels, when all you really want to be doing is taking on the boss. In my opinion, the level design in this game is one of its weakest points. It gets better later on in the game, don't get me wrong. They start to toss in a couple of switchbacks, hidden pathways that can be unlocked, doors that can be opened revealing new areas, staples from this genre certainly. But they are few and far between, frankly. And honestly, it hardly justifies exploration for its own sake. We've all tried Soulsborne games where the level design is masterful and you want to explore every nook and cranny simply for its own sake, or to find a badass weapon that's going to fundamentally change the way that you play the game. But unfortunately, in Wo Long Fallen Dynasty, there really are very few rewards that are worth finding. Instead, it's just an overabundance of junk that you're going to be finding. And as I mentioned earlier, the morale system largely guides you where you need to go. And I never found myself exploring for the sake of exploring, but rather just trying to find where the flag post was that I needed to get so I could take on the boss, which is the thing that I actually wanted to do. And while you technically could take on the boss before you've collected all of the morale points in that area, it's clear that they want you to find all of these before trying it, which is why they put in the top right corner of the screen next to the compass all of the different types of flags that they expect you to collect as you explore. Because it's pretty clear that they didn't want players to go into the boss fight just assuming that they were at the highest morale ranking that they could get for that level, but rather they wanted players to be informed just what they had missed. So if they get to the boss room, see the cutscene, realize that the boss is a level, say, 15 morale ranking, and it's going to be very difficult to take on without some additional help, they're going to die to that boss pretty quickly because they're underleveled, and then go back out into the level to try and find where the different flag posts are. Honestly, instead of it feeling as though they had justified exploration, often it just felt like I was being sent home from an assignment that I wasn't prepared for. And it doesn't really feel good to get to a boss fight, see the cutscene, get excited to take it on, only to realize that you need to spend another 20 minutes running around very tight corridors and poorly lit hallways in order to find where some small square box is that you can shove a pole into. It's an interesting concept, and it certainly forced me to see more of this game's nooks and crannies than I would have of my own volition, but it often feels as though I'm just being forced to do something I really don't want to do. It's like in Batman Arkham Knight when they kept forcing you to play those tank sections. It's fine, I guess, but this isn't why I'm playing the game. I'm playing the game because I want to be Batman, not because I want to play some sort of mech Rocket League ripoff. But setting that aside, a couple of quick things I want to touch on: the performance, narrative, and pacing. As for the performance, on PlayStation 5, it's pretty solid. I did ask for a PC code and an Xbox code, as I mentioned at the top of the video, but I was told that none were available. Apparently, only PlayStation 5 codes were available, which is a bit of a bummer considering this is an Xbox Game Pass title on day one. I will say I've heard rumblings that the PC port has had some issues, even in the demo that went out, I believe, last week, so I would certainly do your homework before putting up the money for it. As for Xbox Game Pass versions, I honestly have no idea how it runs there, but if it's similar to the PlayStation 5's performance, it's generally pretty good. I only ran into a couple of small stutters during this particularly hairy boss fight, but other than that, it's pretty rock solid. And of course, once again, I just want to mention that PlayStation Cloud Save glitch. The fact that I ran into it multiple times makes me really worried that one of you guys will run into it, so I guess just be cautious with the cloud saves if you are one of the types of people like me to play on multiple consoles. I have the PS5 down here, I have it in the family room, I've got the bedroom, so I just often do cloud saves and bounce between them as I'm watching like my 1-year-old upstairs in the living room I can be playing, and then I close that app and it uploads, and then I come down here to the studio and keep playing from there, and then that closes down. I can play it up in the bedroom. I do it all the time with various games, and this is the first time I've run into this issue where just straight up saves were corrupted when going into the PlayStation Cloud. So just be careful, because I don't want you to be like working your way through this game and then hit an issue like that. That would really, really suck. As for the narrative and pacing, both are nothing to write home about. The story and its characters are probably going to be much more interesting to you if you are familiar with Chinese history and the notable historical figures therein. As a Coloradoan, I will be completely honest and say that I have no freaking clue who most of these people are. I've been told that most of the characters and even many of the bosses are directly inspired from notable historical figures within Chinese history and mythology, which I'm sure is going to be awesome for those of you who understand it and are aware of it. But to me, somebody from the outside, it really just seemed like a cellophane story. And in case you haven't heard me use that term before, basically it's just a term I use for stories within games that exist purely just to justify the gameplay's existence and nothing more. You're not really supposed to take stories like this too seriously. They don't really expect you to take any notes or to remember every character's name, and they're not playing for emotional beats or anything significant of the sort. Rather, it exists simply to contain the rest of the game. In many ways, it's the same concept that could be applied to a lot of pieces of this title's puzzle. The poor texture quality, the lackluster level design, and at times the frustratingly boring set pieces all scream that this is a game that is justified purely by its combat system and broadly by nothing else. And to be clear, I don't think that this is an inherently bad thing. Some great games have very cellophane-like stories that are not really meant to be taken super seriously. I don't have a problem with this. I think it's totally fine. So don't think I'm like criticizing the game for this. I think it's actually perfectly fine. I do think it's important to note that they could probably cut all of the cutscenes, all of the narrative, all of the conversations between characters. They could cut all of that, and I honestly don't think it would really change that much of the game at the end of the day. In fact, it might help it because there's issues with pacing when it comes to the story as well. Of course, every time you begin a boss fight, there's going to be a lengthy cutscene that takes place before that justifies that boss's existence. And usually these things are actually really cool. And I personally love the cinematic intros for these boss fights. I think it's awesome. But what is often frustrating is that once you beat the boss, you're going to have a post-boss cutscene, which can be multiple minutes long, often closer to 5 minutes long, where characters are talking quietly and softly to each other about things that you'll largely not give a crap about. I'd be lying if I said that this didn't feel like a buzzkill a lot of the time. I just defeated some crazy multi-headed monstrosity, and now we're walking quietly through a garden, talking about the top of the mountain that we need to get to defeat the mighty enemies that are pissing us off because we're mad. We're straight up pissed about it, and we need to get there. And once we're there, we can have a supple tea session where we can talk to each other about our lives, and we can cuddle while eating crimpets and biscuits. And this got weirdly British for some reason. I was like, I don't know what just happened. I blacked out. Okay, back to it. The other time pacing comes up as an issue is within level exploration. Like I said, you'll get to the boss arena, get really excited to take them on, only to realize that you are woefully unprepared and that you need to leave and explore a mediocre, poorly laid out level in order to find where various flagpoles are. It's not fun, it's frustrating, and it was the low point of every chapter I went through. That being said, there are some really cool quality of life additions here that I do want to give Team Ninja credit for, because this is something that I think should be the standard in games like this, and to see them toss a lot of this stuff in was really cool. Examples would be the fact that most of the armor sets are actually really cool looking, and that if you find a piece of armor that you want to use that isn't cool looking, or if it doesn't work with your current set, you can actually change and transmog its appearance into another set, so that you have a unified look. A cool addition that I didn't feel was necessary, and yet it's really cool to see here. Or perhaps we could look at the fact that later in the game you can gain access to reattribution of skills, the ability to rework your appearance if you're not happy with it, and even something as small as the ability to go into the menus to just turn off your helmet. All of these little additions show that the devs thought about all these little details and wanted to make sure that players got those quality of life additions. And I really think they deserve credit for that. Other small things I didn't expect them to include, such as the ability to swap out enchantments, which are what determines smaller stat boosts to gear, was a really cool addition. Personally, I didn't find myself fiddling with it too much, as it started to feel needlessly tedious since the rest of the loot is so hyper abundant. Like, seriously, you will get so much freaking random crap while exploring these these levels. Most of it you will never touch or use because almost all of it is significantly worse than what you will already be using, especially once you go to the blacksmith and begin upgrading your gear to refine your build. All of this ground loot will effectively become useless immediately. And to be fair, this is something that's been present in every single Team Ninja game that I can think of, so the fact that it remains here seems to me a conscious decision. This probably means that there's a good chunk of fans that love this stuff, that is the hyperabundance of loot and the extreme fine-tuning of equipment that they empower you to use. I just personally happen to be in the group of their fans that finds it overly tedious and kind of annoying at times. Thankfully, you don't have to engage it with that level of nitty-gritty detail if you don't want to. I found a couple of weapons early on that I really enjoyed using, one heavy with slow attacks and another that was quicker for close ranged engagements with bosses that moved quickly and grunts that were hyper chaotic, and I then upgraded those as the game went on, and I never felt as though I was at any sort of significant disadvantage to an alternative version of myself that spent an hour carefully crafting these things. But I mean, all told, there's a lot that this game does very well, but there's also a lot that it does really poorly. And often with games like that, we end up in, again, the B- sort of 8 out of 10, 7.5 out of 10 range, where the game is good, but not great. And the thing is, and something that I'm frustrated that seems to have been forgotten in the industry recently, is that good games, not great games, but good games can still be worth playing. You don't have to have a perfect 10 out of 10 every single time. You can have a good game that's still worth enjoying. It's just maybe not worth $70. Maybe instead it's worth getting on sale at $40 or $35. And that's where this game falls. Now, some of you, I'm sure, were watching this and looking at the game, and you were already going to buy this at full price on PS5 or PC. And you know what? More power to you. If this looks to be checking all of your boxes and you want to get it at full price, you know who you are and you're going to do it. And I am more than happy to see that you are getting a game that you are excited about. And as long as you're going into it informed with what it has to offer, you understand the constraints and issues here, and you are still informed and deciding to go forward, more power to you. I think that's awesome. But for most players, I would personally recommend that you either wait for a sale or you go and play this on Game Pass where there's no additional cost to you. You can just download the game and start playing without paying any extra money up front. Once again, it's just another example of how Game Pass fundamentally changes the way that we review and critique games like this, because now instead of having to maybe get it at $35 or $25 or wait for this point, we can just say I think this is worth a try, especially if you like FromSoft Soulsborne games. If you loved Elden Ring and you're looking for another fix, this game is a great one to tackle, especially because I think once this clicks with you, once the parry system clicks, I find it significantly easier than games like Sekiro or even Elden Ring, if we're bringing that up. So I would personally recommend that you give it a shot. But again, if you're playing on a platform where you have to pay full price, I would probably hold off on this. It's a good game, but it also feels horrifically outdated in a lot of ways. And I hope that as they move on and they continue to make new games and upgrade their engine and things, that they can take notes from this and hopefully start to bring their engine into this decade. That would be awesome. Because while the game works well and it serves the purpose, often this game is just kind of ugly while you're exploring levels. Boss fights are really cool, fun, and even often stunning, but every other portion of the game often is just lackluster and subpar. And I think that's worth bringing up, because if we just continue to sort of hand wave it away, they will never push the boundary or do better because they simply won't need to. So I think us holding their feet to the fire a little bit is probably good for everybody. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you to Koei Tecmo for sending over the review code. Very generous of them to do it. We were on a bit of a time crunch with this one, which is why this critique review thing is going up on launch day instead of in the day before or days before launch. It's just because we were on a bit of a crunch. The review code for this came 2 days or so before, 2.5 days, I don't know, before launch. It was a little bit before launch. So it came down to the wire. But you know what am I complaining about? First world problems, right? Oh no, I have to play video games. Wow. Can you imagine? I can't. Oh, anyway, thank you for watching. I love you guys so much. Join me over on Luke Stevens Live right now. If you're watching this review on launch day, I'm probably streaming at this very moment, or I'm about to start streaming. So come by, say hi, just look up Luke Stevens Live in the search bar. Check it out there. And I will see you when I see you. Much love. I'm bad at outros. Bye.